I still remember the exact temperature of the room the night I realized I didn't have a family anymore. I was standing on a brightly lit auditorium stage, holding a valedictorian diploma that had cost me 4 years of sleepless nights, staring down at 2 empty velvet seats in the front row. 5 miles away, my parents were popping expensive champagne and throwing a lavish backyard party for my brother Julian, simply because he had managed to score a low passing grade on a remedial exam. I was the brilliant, self-sufficient daughter they never had to worry about, so they simply stopped seeing me entirely. But they see me now. Because exactly 1 decade later, I am the only shield standing between them and total destruction. When Julian's reckless habits finally bled my parents' bank accounts completely dry, they didn't just lose their savings, they made the fatal mistake of borrowing money from a ruthless, subterranean loan shark syndicate operating out of the city's shipping ports. They defaulted on the debt, unknowingly signing over the deed of our childhood home as collateral to a cold-blooded, fiercely protective Korean Mafia heir named Kwon Woo. My parents thought they were walking into a high-rise glass penthouse to beg an untouchable underworld executioner for their lives. They had no idea that Kwon Woo didn't own their debt. As my heavy leather chair slowly rotated to face them, my mother's hand flew to her mouth, and my father stumbled back in absolute, trembling horror. Standing directly behind me, with his dark suit jacket unbuttoned and an elegant black ink dragon tattoo creeping up his neck, was the city's most feared syndicate boss. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking down at me with raw, undisguised devotion. They had come to beg a monster for mercy, only to find out that the monster answered entirely to the ghost they had abandoned. How does a child become entirely invisible in her own home? It doesn't happen with a sudden shout or a door slamming shut. It happens in the quiet, agonizing erosion of everyday importance. It is a slow-motion vanishing act, made of 1,000 not right nows, a lifetime of missed school plays, and an unyielding family rule that Julian's fragile ego always required their undivided attention. By the time I turned 18, I was nothing more than a phantom haunting the hallways of a house that belonged exclusively to someone else. I learned to make my footsteps silent. I learned to pack my own lunches, sign my own permission slips, and tuck myself in at night, comforted only by the cold, logical perfection of my textbooks. While Julian was rewarded with expensive electronics for barely showing up to class, my straight-A report cards were met with a dismissive nod and a reminder to keep the noise down because your brother is resting. The night of my graduation, the bitter reality of my existence finally fractured the last piece of my innocence. I walked home completely alone in the damp evening air, the cheap gold tassel on my mortarboard bouncing rhythmically against my cheek. It felt like a mocking pendulum, a heavy reminder of an academic triumph that absolutely no one cared to witness. As I turned the corner onto our quiet suburban street, a sudden, foolish spark of hope ignited in my chest. The house was completely ablaze with warm golden light, and the heavy bass of thumping, joyful music spilled out of the open living room windows. For one desperate, beautiful second, I allowed myself to believe in a lie. Maybe they surprised me, I thought, my heart hammering against my ribs. Maybe the empty seats in the auditorium were just part of a grand plan to celebrate me here. But the moment I stepped through the front door, the heavy aroma of expensive ribeye steak and the sharp pop of a champagne cork instantly shattered the illusion. The entire entryway was suffocated by bright red balloons. A giant, glittering banner hung proudly across the brick fireplace. "Congratulations, Julian. You did it." Julian was slumped casually on the leather sofa, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face as my father ceremoniously poured him a glass of vintage sparkling cider. My father's booming voice echoed with a profound, emotional pride that I had never once tasted in my entire life. "To my boy," he toasted, raising his glass high. "A passing grade. I always knew you had the brains, son. Hard work pays off. Tomorrow morning, we are going straight to the dealership to look at that sports car we discussed." I stood paralyzed in the doorway, my valedictorian diploma clutched so tightly in my hand that the parchment began to crumple. The deafening silence of my own entrance felt like a physical weight. I felt like a monochrome shadow intruding upon a vibrant, technicolor world that had completely edited me out of the script. My voice was barely a whisper when I finally spoke, yet it cut through the drunken laughter like a razor blade. I graduated as the top student in the state today. The room froze instantly. The ice in the silver bucket rattled into stillness. My mother slowly turned around, blinking her eyes as if her brain were working in slow motion to remember exactly who I was. There was no warmth in her face, only a sudden, sharp flicker of irritation. "Oh, Arya," she sighed heavily, reaching up to adjust her pearls with an annoyed click of her tongue. "We told you weeks ago that we were completely stretched thin preparing for Julian's big night. You are the smart one, dear. You don't need the extra fuss or the constant validation. Why must you always choose to be so incredibly selfish on your brother's special day? You have no idea how hard he had to struggle just to pass that curriculum." I looked at the glittering banner. I looked at the perfectly seared steaks on their plates. I looked down at the diploma in my shaking hand, the physical manifestation of 4 years of starvation, of endless sleepless nights, of driving myself to absolute perfection, all in the desperate, quiet hope that this trophy would finally be the one to make my parents look at me. But a borderline failing grade from Julian was worth more to them than a lifetime of flawless excellence from me. I didn't cry. The tears had permanently dried up years ago. Somewhere between the third and fourth time, they entirely forgot my birthday. Instead, a terrifyingly cold, crystalline clarity settled deep into my bones. It was the kind of mental frost that feels like liquid ice flowing through your veins, numbing the pain and replacing it with an unshakable resolve. Slowly, deliberately, I walked over to the kitchen trash can. I took off my graduation cap and let it drop heavily into the garbage. The valedictorian honor cord followed right behind it, settling over the discarded scraps of Julian's celebratory dinner. "You're entirely right, Mom," I said, my voice eerily steady, devoid of a single tremble. "I don't need the fuss. And starting tomorrow, you will never have to worry about me being selfish ever again. Because I am leaving this house, and I am taking my entire future with me." My father let out a short, mocking laugh, refusing to even lower his champagne glass to look at me properly. "Go then, Arya. Go play at being an independent adult. You'll be crawling back through that front door in a week, once you realize exactly how expensive the real world is, and that absolutely nobody out there gives a damn about your GPA." I looked at him, really looked at his face for the absolute last time as his daughter. I would rather starve in a world that doesn't know my name than spend another second in a house that actively refuses to see my face. I walked up the stairs, packed a single, battered suitcase with the few personal items I truly owned, and walked out into the dark night. I didn't wait for a goodbye. I had spent 18 years waiting. I was finally done. The first 6 months in the city were a grueling, exhausting blur of neon streetlights and the bitter smell of cheap coffee. My father had been right about exactly one thing: the world was unforgivingly expensive. But he was fundamentally wrong about everything else. I found a cramped, damp room in a run-down boarding house that constantly smelled of chemical floor wax and decaying newspapers. To survive, I worked 3 separate jobs. I was a waitress by day, an aggressive telemarketer by evening, and I spent my midnight hours scrubbing the pristine marble floors of the massive corporate skyscrapers downtown, the exact buildings I dreamed of commanding one day. I distinctly remember one freezing night in January, on my knees scrubbing the floor of a chief executive's office on the 45th floor. The glittering city lights stretched out beneath the glass like a massive carpet of diamonds. My muscles were screaming with exhaustion, my hands were raw and burning from harsh cleaning chemicals, and my bank account was down to my literal last $4. But as I leaned back and caught my reflection in the dark, cold glass of the window, I didn't see the invisible, broken daughter anymore. I saw a woman who was slowly, methodically pouring a foundation of pure steel. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in the shadows of the shipping ports, a completely different kind of power was ruling the city. Quan Wu lived in a world where weakness was an immediate death sentence. As the fiercely protected, hyper-lethal heir to the legendary Kang Syndicate, his entire existence had been forged in tactical dominance, absolute operational control, and corporate warfare. He wasn't a standard, reckless street thug. Quan Wu was a brilliant, highly educated shadow monarch who wore bespoke Italian suits to cover the intricate, sprawling black ink dragon tattoo that climbed up his neck. He managed the syndicate's multi-billion-dollar international logistics networks with a cold, unreadable precision that terrified his rivals and commanded absolute loyalty from his men. He was a man who believed only in leverage, strategic calculation, and the absolute elimination of anyone who threatened his borders. He lived a life of isolated, dangerous luxury until a chaotic digital anomaly in his syndicate's secure asset accounts brought his empire to a grinding halt and put him on a direct collision course with the one woman who would refuse to bow to his shadow. The corporate world is governed by a simple rule: numbers never lie, and they never forget. Over the next 7 years, I weaponized that rule to build my own armor. I clawed my way out of that damp boarding house and transformed myself into the head portfolio analyst at a premier corporate turnaround firm. I became the person multi-billion-dollar companies called when they were drowning the cold. Calculating strategist who could spot a hidden financial bleed in a matter of seconds. I renamed my corporate shell entity Vanguard Asset Solutions, a name that sounded like a standard institutional fund but served as my personal vault. I was no longer Arya, the forgotten phantom. I was a master of capital leverage, completely detached from the emotional chaos that ruined lesser minds. Then, the past landed on my desk with the heavy thud of a foreclosure notice. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when my assistant flagged an high-priority asset seizure filing. A private lender's syndicate had just triggered an immediate, non-negotiable repossession order for a residential property at 34 Oak Crest Drive. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. The address burned into my eyes. I pulled up the deep background audit, and as the encrypted layers of the debt unraveled on my dual monitors, a story of staggering betrayal unfolded. My brother Julian hadn't just failed to finance a luxurious lifestyle for himself and his shallow influencer girlfriend. He had systematically bled our parents' retirement accounts completely dry. But the true horror was the final document. When the legitimate banks cut him off, Julian had forged our father's signature on a high-risk, short-term collateral loan with an exorbitant, astronomical interest rate. He hadn't borrowed from a bank. He had borrowed from a front company belonging directly to the Kang Syndicate, the most feared underground organization in the city. Julian had defaulted on the very first payment, completely abandoning our parents to face the consequences while he hid in a luxury high-rise downtown. The syndicate didn't care about family drama. They were moving in to seize the house, throw my parents onto the pavement, and legally liquidate everything they owned within 48 hours. Standard protocol dictated that I walk away. It was the logical conclusion to the childhood they had given me. They had sown negligence, and it was time for them to reap the absolute ruin of their golden son. But as I stared at the digital blueprint of the small house on Oak Crest Drive, a dangerous, primal spark ignited deep inside my chest. I didn't want them destroyed by a faceless mob. I wanted them to know exactly who possessed the power to save them. I didn't buy the house from under them. I did something infinitely more reckless. I used my firm's elite credentials to intercept the syndicate's legal acquisition filing, freezing their asset seizure in mid-air with a complex web of corporate injunctions. I knew it was a declaration of war, and I knew exactly who would come to collect. Less than 3 hours later, the heavy glass doors of my private office didn't just open. They were practically filled by the imposing presence of 3 men in dark, tailored suits. The 2 flanking guards remained at the perimeter, their hands resting loosely near their jackets, their eyes scanning the room with lethal efficiency. But it was the man in the center who made the air in the room turn to absolute ice. Kwon Woo. He was even more terrifying in person than the hushed rumors in the financial district suggested. He wore a flawless, midnight black bespoke suit, the fabric catching the stark fluorescent lights of my office. His crisp white collar was slightly unbuttoned, revealing the sharp, dark tail of a sprawling black ink dragon tattoo that coiled aggressively up his neck, disappearing behind his jawline. His features were striking sharp, angular, and completely devoid of human warmth. His dark eyes locked onto me with the piercing intensity of a predator that had just found a civilian playing in his hunting grounds. He walked over to my desk, his movements slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply pulled a heavy, solid silver lighter from his pocket, set it down on my mahogany desk with a soft clink, and leaned forward, placing his large, calloused hands on the wood. "You have exactly 2 minutes," Quan Wu said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the quiet room. "Tell me why a corporate analyst is risking her life interfering with a Kang syndicate asset liquidation. People who block my ledger usually find themselves at the bottom of the harbor before the sun goes down." I didn't flinch. I didn't push my chair back. I leaned forward, mirroring his posture, staring directly into those cold, midnight eyes without a single tremor in my frame. "Your ledger is sloppy, Mr. Kang," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through the thick tension like a diamond blade. "You think you're seizing a prime piece of suburban real estate. What you don't know is that the forgery on that loan document makes your title entirely toxic. If you execute that eviction, my firm will tie your shell companies up in federal fraud litigation for the next 5 years. You'll lose 10 times the value of the original debt, just in legal fees and frozen maritime assets at the port." A heavy, dangerous silence descended upon the room. The guards shifted slightly, waiting for the command to dismantle me. But Quan Wu didn't move. A tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitched in his jaw. For the first time in his life, a civilian woman was standing in his shadow, completely unfazed by his reputation, dismantling his leverage with pure, unadulterated logic. Slowly, the cold mask on his face fractured, replaced by a dark, fascinated curiosity. He straightened up, crossing his arms over his broad chest, his gaze tracking every line of my face as if he were trying to read a completely uncrackable code. "You know exactly who I am," he murmured, a dangerous, dark amusement curling the corner of his lips. "And yet, you haven't blinked once. What is your real play here, Arya?" "I want the debt," I stated flatly, sliding a legally binding transfer agreement across the mahogany surface. "My shell company, Vanguard, will buy out Julian's default balance in full, right now. In exchange, you transfer the absolute title of 34 Oakcrest Drive directly to me. You get your liquidity back instantly, and I get the deed." Quan Wu looked down at the document, then back up at me. He stepped closer, his physical presence completely overwhelming the space between us. He leaned down, his face mere inches from mine, the faint scent of expensive cologne and tobacco swirling around us. "I don't need the liquidity," he whispered, his eyes burning into mine with an intense, possessive heat that sent a sudden, strange shiver down my spine. "But I do need someone with your mind. Someone who doesn't fear the dark. I will give you the deed to this house, Arya, but the debt isn't settled. To clear the ledger with me, you will bring your corporate shell under my umbrella. You will manage my syndicate's logistics portfolios. You belong to my operation now." It was a trap wrapped in a golden opportunity. He was offering me the power of an empire, but he was demanding my absolute proximity. I looked at the dark dragon creeping up his neck, then at the unyielding devotion hidden beneath his cold exterior. "Deal," I said, reaching out my hand. Quan Wu gripped my hand in his. His palm was warm, his grip firm and entirely unyielding. He didn't let go immediately. He leaned in closer, his thumb brushing against my skin. "Welcome to the family, Arya. Now, let's go show these people exactly what happens when they cross what belongs to us." The air inside the glass boardroom of Vanguard Asset Solutions felt entirely thin, suffocated by a heavy, trembling terror. My parents sat huddled together on the low leather sofa, looking small, withered, and profoundly out of place against the soaring, minimalist luxury of the high-rise. They looked exactly like what they were, two desperate people who had spent a lifetime hiding from reality, now completely cornered by it. My father was clutching a cheap manila folder to his chest like a shield, his knuckles white and bleeding of color. My mother kept nervously adjusting her faded pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically toward the massive oak doors every single time the shadow of an employee passed by. They didn't know the name of the executive who had summoned them. They only knew that the merciless underground debt collectors who had terrorized their home for the past 48 hours had suddenly vanished, replaced by an ominous, formal invitation to meet the principal of the holding firm that now controlled their lives. "Richard, please," my mother whispered, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, pathetic panic that grated against the silence of the room. "What if they don't give us an extension? What if Julian can't fix this by tomorrow? They said they take everything." My father swallowed hard, his chest heaving under his wrinkled suit jacket. "Julian is working on a deal, Helen. He promised me. He just needs a few more days to liquidate some assets. This is just a standard corporate meeting. We just have to explain the situation to the director." They still believed in him, even at the absolute precipice of their destruction. With the wolf at the door and their lives completely unraveled, their default setting was to protect the myth of their golden son. "Hold on just a second, my beautiful family. I need to interrupt this absolute psychological chess match right here, because my jaw is officially on the floor. Can we just take a collective breath for Arya? Her toxic parents completely erased her from their lives, treated her like a phantom, and threw her into the shadows, and now they are literally on their knees, begging a ruthless Korean mafia boss for mercy, completely oblivious to the fact that their invisible daughter is the one pulling the strings of his entire global empire. Talk about the ultimate, delicious revenge. If your heart is racing right now, and you are completely captivated by Arya's brilliant mind and Kwon Woo's fiercely protective, obsessed devotion, do not let this empire pass you by. Right now, pause the video for just 2 seconds. Smash that like button, and hit subscribe to Annie's Empire of Love. By joining our circle tonight, you make sure you never miss a single chapter of these intense, slow burn-blam romance thrillers. And while you're down there, drop a comment and tell me, would you have saved your family like Arya did? Or would you have let Kwon Woo's men throw them on the streets? I'm reading and replying to our global family right now. Now, let's get right back to the boardroom. Because the look on her father's face when Arya slowly rotates that leather chair, it is about to change everything. Let's continue. The heavy oak doors clicked open, the sound cutting through their frantic whispering like a gunshot. My parents stood up instantly, their expressions twisted into masks of subservient, desperate humility. But as the heavy high-back leather chair at the head of the long boardroom table slowly rotated around to face them, the rehearsed speech on my father's lips died instantly. My mother let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth so quickly her pearls rattled against her throat. Her knees buckled slightly, forcing her to drop heavily back onto the sofa. My father stumbled backward, his eyes widening into huge, unblinking circles of absolute, paralyzing horror. They weren't looking at a faceless corporate director. They were staring directly into the eyes of the ghost they had discarded 10 years ago. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded elegantly over the pristine, thick stack of legal documents resting on the glass table. I wore a tailored, emerald green silk blazer that radiated absolute, untouchable authority. My hair was pulled back into a sharp, flawless style, and my expression was entirely unreadable, a mask of pure, crystalline composure that I had spent a decade forging in the dark. "Good afternoon, Mom, Dad," I said, my voice smooth, even, and entirely devoid of heat. It was the tone of an auditor delivering a routine quarterly assessment. "Please, have a seat." Arya?" My father stammered, his voice thick, breathy, and shaking so violently he could barely form the syllables. He looked around the sprawling, multi-million-dollar room, his brain actively short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the starving teenager he had mocked in a doorway with the powerful woman commanding the top floor of the city's most elite skyscraper. "How? What is the meaning of this? Why are you sitting in this office?" "I own this office, Dad," I stated flatly, sliding the thick stack of papers forward by an inch. "And as of exactly 8 o'clock this morning, I also own the deed, the mortgage, and every single square inch of the dirt beneath 34 Oakcrest Drive." You bought the house?" My mother whimpered, a sudden, desperate flash of ugly hope igniting in her tear-filled eyes. She leaned forward, reaching her hands out across the glass as if she expected me to run into them. Oh, thank heaven. Arya, you saved us. I knew you were a good girl. I knew you wouldn't let your family go to the streets. Your brother Julian, he's just in a little bit of trouble right now. But Julian isn't in trouble. Helen, a cold, terrifyingly dark voice boomed from the shadows behind my chair. The temperature in the boardroom dropped straight to freezing. Quan Wu stepped out from the dark corner of the room, his massive, imposing frame instantly dominating the entire space. His midnight black suit jacket was unbuttoned, and as he crossed his broad arms over his chest, the intricate, lethal coils of the black ink dragon tattoo climbing up his neck caught the direct sunlight from the floor to ceiling windows. My parents shrank back into the cushions of the sofa, their faces turning a sickly, translucent white. They recognized him instantly. He was the shadow monarch of the city, the man whose name was whispered in terror across every underground ledger. They thought he was there to destroy them. Quan Wu didn't look at them. His eyes remained fixed entirely on the side of my face, his expression softening into an intense, fiercely protective devotion that sent a thrill of electric warmth rushing down my spine. He placed one large, calloused hand firmly on the back of my leather chair, letting my parents see the heavy gold signet ring of the Kong Syndicate resting against my shoulder. He was marking his territory. He was telling the world exactly who I belonged to, and who belonged to me. Your son didn't just make a mistake, Quan Wu said, his low baritone cutting through the room with the weight of an executioner's blade. He systematically forged your signatures on a toxic collateral loan with my syndicate. He took $500,000 of my organization's capital, used your home as bait, and spent every single cent of it buying a luxury high-rise condominium and a European sports car for his girlfriend downtown. Quan Wu leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto my father with lethal promise. If it wasn't for Arya stepping directly into my path, my men would have thrown you onto the pavement 48 hours ago, and your son would currently be at the bottom of the shipping ports. You are breathing right now for one reason, and one reason only, because the daughter you abandoned possessed the brilliance to buy your lives back from me. A suffocating, agonizing silence fell over the room. My father dropped the manila folder, the cheap papers scattering across the polished floor like dead leaves. He looked at the floor, then at Quan Wu, and finally, up at me. A profound, crushing regret settling into the deep lines of his face, a regret that came exactly 10 years too late. Arya, my mother sobbed, the tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks, her voice thick with a pathetic, desperate longing. We didn't know. We were so wrong. Please, can we just go home? Can we be a family again? Let us make this up to you. Come home for dinner. Just this once. I looked at her. I looked at her shaking hands, her tear-stained face, and the empty space between us. 10 years ago, I would have given my literal soul for those words. I would have crawled through broken glass just to hear her ask me to stay for dinner. But looking at them now, flanked by the immense power of my own creation and the unyielding protective shadow of the most dangerous man in the city, I felt absolutely nothing. The little girl who wanted their love had died in the trash can along with her graduation cap. Slowly, deliberately, I tapped the legal documents on the table. The house is yours, I said softly, my voice completely devoid of malice, yet heavier than iron. The default is cleared, the utilities are paid, the fridge is full, you have a roof over your heads, and you have your health. You will never see a debt collector again. My father looked up, a broken, trembling hope in his eyes. Does that mean you're coming back? No, I replied, standing up smoothly and smoothing down the front of my emerald blazer. I am your savior today because I am a seasoned professional, but I am not your daughter because you explicitly decided you didn't want one. Blood makes you related, Richard, but loyalty, respect, and protection make you a family. I turned my head slightly, looking back at Quan Wu. He was already moving, stepping forward to pull my chair back, his dark eyes burning into mine with an absolute, unshakable reverence. He didn't offer loyalty based on Dina. He offered it because he recognized my worth. My life is elsewhere, I said to the two people on the sofa. I have an international shipping portfolio to restructure and a flight to catch. I walked toward the massive oak doors, my high heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, no longer a silent phantom, but a woman whose every step carried the weight of an empire. As I reached the handle, I stopped, refusing to turn around. I'll have my Vanguard corporate office send a property manager once a week to inspect the foundation of the house. If the roof leaks, call the number on my business card. But do not call my personal phone. I stepped out into the corridor. Kwon Woo followed immediately behind me, his large hand settling firmly, possessively at the small of my back. His thumb tracing a comforting circle against the fabric of my blazer. The heavy glass doors of the skyscraper opened, and we stepped out into the crisp, clean evening air. The rain that had threatened all morning had finally stopped, leaving the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement like a sea of liquid diamonds. Kwon Woo's sleek, black armored vehicle was waiting at the curb, his security detail standing at absolute attention. As the driver opened the door, I paused, looking back one last time at the towering glass monolith behind me. The invisible daughter didn't need their eyes to see her value anymore. She had built her own light, and she had conquered the very shadows that tried to consume her. Kwon Woo stepped into my space, shielding me from the cool wind with his broad shoulders. He reached out, his large, tattooed fingers gently cupping my chin, forcing me to look up into his dark, intense gaze. "They never saw what you were, Arya," he murmured, his voice a low, rough caress against the quiet night. "They treated a diamond like a common pebble. But to me, you are the crown jewel of the entire empire." "I know," I whispered, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across my lips as I let him guide me into the warmth of the vehicle. Success isn't about the numbers in the bank or the titles on a glass door. It's about having the absolute strength to survive the people who were supposed to love you and the absolute grace to save them anyway. Even if you never, ever look back. The heavy armored door clicked shut, sealing out the damp, roaring sounds of the city traffic. Inside the vehicle, the air was warm, quiet, and thick, with a completely different kind of intensity. The leather seats were plush, but the real comfort came from the sudden, profound release of a 10-year-old weight crushing my chest. I leaned my head back against the headrest, closing my eyes as the sleek vehicle glided away from the curb. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The quiet rhythm of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence until I felt a heavy, comforting warmth settle over my lap. I opened my eyes and looked down. Kwon Woo had reached across the wide console, separating our seats. His large, calloused hand was covering mine, his long fingers threading securely between my own. The dark, elegant tail of the dragon tattoo on his wrist pressed firmly against my skin. He didn't squeeze tightly. He simply held me with a grounded, unyielding pressure that told me he wasn't going anywhere. "You handled that with more grace than they deserved," he said, his eyes never leaving the dark window as he watched the glittering city lights bleed past us in long golden streaks. "Most people in your position would have let my men clear the house. They would have watched the eviction from a distance and celebrated the ruin." I let out a soft, breathy laugh, turning my palm up so I could properly grip his hand back. Letting them go to the streets would have been too easy, Kwon Woo. It would have made me look like I was still angry. It would have proven that they still had the power to make me suffer. I looked out my own window, watching my reflection catch the passing neon signs of the financial district. Giving them that house wasn't an act of kindness. It was the ultimate boundary. Every single time they walk into the kitchen, every time they sit in the living room, and every time they look at the roof over their heads, they will be forced to remember that the daughter they threw away is the only reason they aren't sleeping on cardboard. I didn't give them a home. I gave them a beautifully gilded cage of their own regret. Kwon Woo turned his head, a dark, incredibly rare smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The sheer, predatory admiration in his gaze made my pulse stutter. "You are utterly ruthless, Arya. A true strategist." I'm beginning to realize I didn't just acquire a portfolio manager for my syndicate today. I brought a queen into my territory. "Don't forget it," I murmured, leaning closer to him as he pulled me against his broad side, his heavy arm wrapping securely around my shoulders to shield me from the world. because the moment your ledger gets sloppy, Mr. Kang, I'm coming for your throne next. He let out a low, gravelly chuckle that vibrated beautifully against my frame, his lips pressing a quiet, possessive kiss against the top of my head. I look forward to watching you try. As the vehicle sped toward the private airfield, leaving the ghosts of Oak Crest Drive permanently in the dust, I finally understood the true definition of a resolution. The invisible girl was officially gone. She didn't need her parents' validation to exist, and she didn't need their eyes to see her worth. She had climbed out of the trenches of neglect, survived the very people who were meant to protect her, and built an empire of pure, unyielding steel. And beside her, holding the keys to the city, was a man who saw her brilliance not as a threat, but as a crown. The story of Arya and Quan Wu is a heavy one. It is a raw, emotional journey about how deep childhood neglect can either break a person completely or forge a weapon capable of conquering the darkest corners of the world. Arya chose to be a savior to the family that abandoned her, but she also made the absolute, unshakable choice to be entirely free of them. Now, I want to turn the conversation over to you, our incredible community. If you were standing in Arya's designer shoes today, what would your choice have been? Would you have left your parents to face the absolute terrifying consequences of Julian's criminal choices to teach them a lesson? Or would you have bought that house just to stand in that high-rise boardroom and show them exactly what they lost the moment they let you walk out that door 10 years ago? And let's talk about that boardroom showdown. Which moment completely took your breath away? Was it the sudden, shocking reveal when Arya rotated her chair to face her trembling parents? Or was it the chilling moment Quan Wu stepped out of the shadows, exposing Julian's massive $500,000 fraud and showing her family that their discarded daughter was now backed by the most feared shadow empire in the city? Let me know your absolute thoughts, your personal theories, and your perspectives in the comments section down below. Your personal insights, your passion, and your incredible stories are what make this community such a deeply special place to be. If Arya's journey of resilience, toxic family dynamics, and high-stakes mafia romance touched your heart today, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Annie's Empire of Love. By joining our family, you ensure you never miss a single chapter of these intense, emotional journeys. We have so many more incredible stories to share, tales of breathtaking betrayal, unstoppable survival, and the hidden, powerful truths that define our lives. Turn on your notification bell so you are the absolute first to know when our next cinematic story drops. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your incredible support. And always remember, in Annie's Empire of Love, love is the only law worth breaking. Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the very next story.